What we're seeing right now isn't just another spike in tension, it's a clear shift into a completely different phase of conflict. In the past, most actions between these sides were indirect, controlled, and often carried out through proxies or limited operations. But now the pattern looks very different. The moves are more direct, more visible, and much harder to contain. This new phase is defined by the scale and type of actions being taken. Instead of symbolic responses or behind-the-scenes pressure, we're seeing operations that have immediate impact and global attention. These are not low-level signals anymore. They are high-stakes decisions that carry real consequences, both militarily and politically. Another major change is the speed at which everything is happening. Events are unfolding rapidly, sometimes within hours, leaving very little room for diplomatic efforts to slow things down. When situations escalate this quickly, it becomes harder for leaders to pause, reassess, or step back. Decisions are made under pressure, and that increases the risk of miscalculation. There's also a shift in how openly these actions are being carried out. In previous situations, there was often a level of deniability or distance maintained. Now the lines are much clearer, and the actions are more direct, making it obvious who is involved and what the intentions might be. That level of transparency, while informative, also raises the stakes because it invites immediate response. At the same time, the involvement of major powers adds another layer of complexity. When countries with significant military capabilities begin to take more active roles, the entire dynamic changes. It's no longer just a regional issue. It becomes something with global implications, drawing attention from allies, competitors, and international organizations. All of this points to a situation that is no longer operating under the old rules. The boundaries that once kept things limited are becoming less defined, and as those boundaries shift, the potential for wider escalation grows stronger with each move being made. The strike on a major gas field represents more than just a military action. It signals a deliberate move toward targeting the backbone of a nation's economic and strategic stability. Energy infrastructure like this isn't just important locally. It plays a critical role in global supply, pricing, and long-term market confidence. When a site of that scale becomes a target, the message being sent is much broader than the immediate damage. These kinds of locations are chosen very carefully. They are high-value, high-visibility targets that instantly draw international attention. Hitting an energy facility shows not only capability but also intent. It demonstrates that the conflict is no longer limited to isolated or symbolic actions, but is now touching assets that have long-term national importance. There's also a strong economic dimension to this kind of move. Even the threat to such infrastructure can influence global oil and gas markets. Investors react, prices fluctuate, and countries that depend on stable energy flows begin to reassess risk. This creates pressure that extends far beyond the immediate conflict zone, affecting economies that may not be directly involved at all. From a strategic standpoint, targeting energy infrastructure can be seen as a way to apply maximum pressure without engaging in full-scale war. It's a calculated step, one that disrupts confidence, sends a strong signal, and forces the opposing side to reconsider its next move very carefully. It raises the cost of continuing the conflict without necessarily crossing into total escalation. At the same time, actions like this increase the stakes for everyone involved. Once critical infrastructure becomes part of the equation, responses are likely to become stronger and more decisive. It narrows the space for restraint and increases the expectation that any retaliation will match or exceed the level of impact. This kind of escalation also changes how the situation is viewed globally. It's no longer seen as a contained series of events, but as a developing crisis with economic, political, and security implications that reach far beyond the region itself. Iran's missile response marks a clear expansion in both scope and signaling, and that's what makes this moment stand out. In earlier situations, responses were often more contained, aimed at specific targets with limited regional impact. But now, the pattern suggests something broader, a willingness to project force beyond a single battlefield and into a wider geographic space. When missile activity begins to extend across multiple areas, it changes how the entire situation is perceived. It's no longer just a direct exchange between two sides. It starts to involve surrounding regions, airspace, and neighboring countries that may not have been directly part of the conflict before. That kind of spread increases tension across a much larger area, making the situation more complex to manage. There's also a strategic message embedded in this kind of response. By expanding the reach, it demonstrates capability, showing that targets are not limited by distance or geography. It signals that escalation doesn't have to stay contained, and that pressure can be applied in multiple directions if needed. That alone forces other countries to reconsider their positioning and preparedness. At the same time, this type of response creates a ripple effect. Neighboring nations begin to heighten their own defenses, monitor their borders more closely, and prepare for scenarios where they could be indirectly affected. Even if they are not involved, the proximity to missile activity raises concerns about safety, security, and stability. Another layer to consider is how this expansion affects decision-making. When the conflict spreads geographically, it introduces more variables, more actors, more risks, and more potential flashpoints. This makes it harder to predict outcomes, as each additional area involved brings its own set of dynamics and pressures. As the reach of these responses grows, so does the sense that the situation is moving beyond a contained conflict and into something that carries wider regional implications, where actions in one place can quickly influence events somewhere else. The growing role of the United States adds a completely new layer to the situation, and that's where the stakes rise even further. When a global superpower begins shifting from observation to a more active posture, it changes how every other player calculates risk. It's no longer just about regional dynamics. It becomes part of a much larger strategic picture. One of the clearest signs of this shift is the increase in military readiness. This doesn't always mean immediate action, but it does signal preparation. Assets are positioned, forces are placed on standby, and contingency plans are updated in real time. These steps are taken to ensure that if the situation escalates suddenly, the response can be immediate and effective. There's also a strong signaling effect behind this involvement. Even without direct engagement, the presence of the United States sends a message of deterrence. It tells other actors that any major escalation could trigger a much broader response. That alone can influence decisions on the ground, as each side begins to weigh not just their opponent's reaction, but the potential involvement of a much larger force. At the same time, the United States has to balance multiple priorities. On one hand, it supports its allies and works to maintain stability in the region. On the other hand, it aims to avoid being pulled into a full-scale conflict. This balancing act creates a situation where actions are measured but still firm enough to show commitment. Diplomatic channels also become more active in moments like this. Behind the scenes, communication between governments increases, with efforts to manage escalation and prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. These discussions may not always be visible, but they play a critical role in shaping what happens next. As U.S. involvement becomes more pronounced, it introduces both stability and risk at the same time. Stability through deterrence, and risk through the possibility that any direct engagement could rapidly expand the scope of the conflict beyond its current limits. The reaction in global energy markets highlights just how quickly a regional conflict can ripple through the world economy. When tensions rise in a region that plays such a critical role in oil and gas production, markets don't wait for outcomes. They respond immediately to uncertainty. Even the possibility of disruption is enough to push prices upward and create volatility. Oil traders and investors closely watch every development because supply routes and production facilities in this region are deeply connected to global demand. When there's a risk that these flows could be interrupted, whether through damage to infrastructure, restricted shipping lanes, or heightened security concerns, it creates a sense of instability that markets tend to price in right away. Shipping routes are another major concern. Key waterways that handle a large portion of the world's energy transport become more sensitive during times of conflict. If there's even a slight threat to these routes, insurance costs rise, shipping slows down, and companies begin to reassess how they move resources from one place to another. That alone can affect delivery timelines and overall supply levels. There's also a psychological factor at play. Markets are driven not just by actual events, but by expectations. When headlines suggest escalation, Traders often react preemptively, which can amplify price movements. This creates a cycle where uncertainty feeds into market behavior, and market behavior, in turn, reflects growing concern about the situation. At the same time, countries that rely heavily on energy imports begin to feel the pressure. Governments may start looking at strategic reserves, adjusting policies, or preparing for potential shortages. Businesses that depend on stable energy costs also have to adapt quickly, as sudden price changes can impact production, transportation, and overall profitability. All of these elements combine to show how closely tied global markets are to geopolitical stability, where even the threat of escalation in a key region can influence economies far beyond the immediate conflict zone. As the situation continues to evolve, one of the biggest concerns is how difficult it's becoming to maintain control over the direction of events. In high-tension environments like this, every action carries weight, and even a calculated move can produce unexpected consequences. The more frequently actions and reactions occur, the harder it becomes to slow things down or create space for de-escalation. A major factor here is the chain reaction effect. When one side takes a step, the other side feels pressure to respond, not just to defend itself, but to maintain credibility and deterrence. That response then creates a new level of tension, prompting another reaction. This cycle can continue rapidly, making it increasingly difficult to break without outside intervention or deliberate restraint. There's also the issue of limited decision time. As events unfold quickly, leaders often have only a short window to assess information and decide on a course of action. In such conditions, the risk of misjudgment increases. A move that is intended to send a limited signal could be interpreted as something much larger, leading to responses that escalate the situation further. Another layer of complexity comes from the number of actors involved, both directly and indirectly. Allies, regional players, and global powers are all watching closely, and in some cases preparing their own responses. This creates a web of interests and expectations, where a single action can influence multiple parties at once, each reacting based on their own priorities. Communication also becomes more challenging under these conditions. While diplomatic channels may still be active, the speed and intensity of events can outpace dialogue. Messages may not be fully understood, or they may arrive too late to prevent a reaction that's already in motion. As these factors build on each other, the overall situation becomes increasingly fragile, where control is no longer just about intention, but about managing a rapidly shifting environment filled with pressure, uncertainty, and interconnected risks.